Welcome to UO Today. I'm Steve Shankman, Director of the Oregon Humanities Center. Our guest is poet Joseph Harrison, author of the book Someone Else's Name, published in 2003. Under the sponsorship of the Oregon Humanities Center and the Creative Writing and English departments, he'll be reading from his work while he visits the University of Oregon. Joe Harrison earned his BA at Yale, his MA at Johns Hopkins. In 2005, he received an Academy Award in Literature from the American Academy of Arts and Letters. He currently serves on the editorial board of the Waywiser Press. His book, Someone Else's Name, was a finalist for the Poets Prize in 2005, and his new book, Identity Theft, will be published in the United Kingdom this year and in the U.S. in 2008. Well, it's great to have you with us.
It's good to be here.
Thanks very much for coming all the way from
Baltimore.
Baltimore. You know, I remember Baltimore from your, I think it was maybe one of the last poems, elegies
Yes.
in the book.
Yes.
So tell us when you started writing poetry.
I actually started writing poetry when I lived in the Pacific Northwest for a couple of years after graduating from college. I decided I wanted to write poetry. Poetry moved me more than anything. But I spent the time I was in college reading a lot of poetry, reading Renaissance poetry and Romantic poetry and modernist poetry, and I knew that was what I wanted to do. And so a friend of mine who also had literary ambitions and I moved out to Seattle after we graduated from college, and that's when I started. All the poems I wrote then wound up in the garbage can, but you have to start somewhere.
Well, that shows a lot of discretion. A lot of poets don't throw stuff out.
Maybe some of them should throw a little more out than they do.
Probably should. So in those days, were you writing in form? The way you...
Sometimes I was, sometimes I wasn't. I was fiddling around with various things. I always felt drawn to forms and found myself continuing to come back to them, though I wrote for quite a while in various modes before settling on that as what I wanted to concentrate on.
Was there a poem that you wrote at one point that just sort of clicked for you and you thought, this is something now I really feel like I can move on from here?
That happened a couple of times. There is a poem, by far the earliest poem in the book is a poem called Frost Heaves, which is a tribute to Frost, and that was written before the other poems in the book. And I remember a friend of mine who was a very good reader told me, I think this is where you're going to wind up going. It took me a few years after that to really wind up going there. In the summer of 1992, I went to the Swanee Writers Conference, which is a wonderful place for aspiring writers to go. And I met the great contemporary American poet Anthony Hecht. And part of the deal with the conference is you get a one-on-one conference with your reader. And that made a very deep impression on me. It was the first time I'd ever sat down with someone I knew to be a great poet, to have them talk about my work. And I could tell from that conversation that he wasn't getting some of what I was doing. He was very sympathetic. He thought it sounded good. He was mystified by some of what I was doing. And I realized I was being perhaps a little too self-indulgent, that I knew what they meant, the very highly coded discourse, but that I wasn't going far enough to meet the reader halfway. I very much admired when I began reading poetry, the poetry of Wallace Stevens, and the quality of mystery that comes through in those poems. But you can't be too mysterious, or the reader simply isn't going to, the poem is not going to have enough traction to repay rereading. And Tony Hecht said something very interesting to me in that conference, which I always remembered. He said, "It will be 6 to 9 months before you see the effects of this conference on your work." And I thought, oh, okay, big guy, whatever you say. I mean, I guess you know what you're talking about. I didn't really take it that seriously. And 6 to 9 months later, wham, something hit. And I realized that I had internalize those lessons. And that's when I wrote the Penelope poem and the first Dante poem that were in that are in someone else's name. And at that point, I was really off and running. And the poems that wound up making up that book came fast and furious after that.
So what happened in those 6 to 9 months, and why do you think psychologically it takes 6 to 9 months to absorb that kind of experience?
I think because it's a very intense experience, and you write, what you write comes from a very visceral place, and if you're writing in a certain mode, you're not just going to turn on a dime and write differently. You're going to start thinking about writing differently. You're going to start thinking about poetic possibilities in a different way. You're going to start imagining how poems could work differently than the poems you write. But I think it's a gestation period, and I think it takes time for that instruction to sort of seep down into the unconscious and then come back out in the form of poems.
What about resistance? I mean, when people tell you something maybe you don't want to hear, I mean, how much is the ego involved in when you're getting, in a sense, criticism really from a master? What does your ego have to somehow be kind of built up again?
Well, there are people who are good at that, and there are people who aren't good at it. One of the interesting things I found with my conference with Hecht is that he didn't really offer any criticism directly. It was implied. I kind of had to. He was encouraging. He liked my stuff. He pointed out some things that he liked. He gave me a couple of general warnings, like go in fear of abstraction, and gave me a couple of books to read. But it was only after sitting down and thinking about what he had said to me that I realized what was unspoken but between the lines, that I wasn't doing enough to offer the reader something. I think if it had been phrased in a more direct way, you're not doing enough to offer the reader something, I think that probably would have met more resistance from me than it did. So he knew how to imply what he had to say, and I was ready enough to hear it from him. You take these things, you have to learn in writing poetry and in showing it to people who to listen to and who not to listen to. People are going to have a range of opinions, and everybody has a different aesthetic, and ultimately you have to be true to your own aesthetic. So, but that's part of the struggle is learning what to take in and what to screen out, and who your best readers are, and who you ignore. You have to ignore the bad reviews because you do get them.
Yeah, exactly.
And you have to just ignore them.
Right. Now, tell me about your poetic models. I hear obviously Shakespeare, Wyatt, Donne, Frost, Wallace Stevens. Who else for you has been a real
Wordsworth, Shelley, Keats. Those were the poets who really made me want to write poetry. I mean, those are the poets who first sort of, when I read them in high school. And then Shakespeare, Donne, Dickinson, they were very important to me when I was an undergraduate. James Merrill, John Ashbery, though people don't hear him in my work, if they saw some of the earlier work, they would hear Ashbery there more. And then when I got a little older, I started to appreciate poets like Frost, Richard Wilbur, Anthony Hecht, who hadn't been the sort of high romantics that I gravitated toward when I was younger, but I began to have more and more appreciation for what they did, and came to use that sort of next wave of influence as a way of sort of positioning myself between what one might call a school of Frost and what might call a school of Stevens. That I thought at points of it sounds highfalutin, but I thought of myself as having a foot in both camps. There are some ways, and I think that sometimes your earliest influences can be a little dangerous. You can sound, I mean, there were points where I sounded painfully like Stevens, and I had to write that out of me. And the influence of Frost and of Wilbur and of Hecht were all good for getting me beyond the sort of Vatic declaration that I was drawn to when I was a younger man.
Well, speaking of Stevens, I certainly hear Stevens in the poem Words on page 97.
Yeah.
Would you mind reading that
Not
one
at
for
all.
us? It's
Not at all.
It's a real tour de force of language.
Words on words. He opened the largest book, and here they came, the frank, the angled, and the hammered Latin of ceremonial vessels, all in rows, quicksilver, paid on both sides, implicated, astral, claustral, crystal, murky, crossed out or floated forth, rigged like a flight of fancy calculation, riding the waves of dream and trauma, thrill and desperation. Oh, let her see, at sea on the letter C, and all for love of something in the mirror, not you, the curve of the world, all color and sky, sunlight and fenestration, opening on Rome. To be referred to, signpost, in this language they are, and it must change, and they must change, captured by science, context, or confusion, parameters turning perimeters in a fog, but calling out always to all they would name, the sign thing, sine curve thing, like thing and sign were thing and wave at once, a cursive sign written on water by wind with fire from earth, in the richest contradictions of connotation, doing a triple backflip, telling a joke on up through inside under over and out.
A tour de force of language.
Thank you.
Yeah. First of all, I hadn't planned on asking you this, but your style of reading, people don't pay much attention. I remember Ivor Winters had a famous essay called The Audible Reading of Poetry, and a lot of things students, for example, don't learn is how to hear poetry. And obviously when you read it, you have a style of reading. Now, when did you develop that, and how much is that part of your writing?
It very much is a part of the writing. I mean, Eliot at one point was asked by, he received a letter from, I think it was R.P. Blackmer, who was telling him about all the, or no, actually it was Cleanth Brooks, I believe, who was telling him about all the wonderful things he had discovered in the wasteland and all the meanings within meanings. And Eliot wrote back and said, well, that's very brilliant, and thank you for saying that, but actually the decisions one makes in composition are more musical decisions than they are decisions about the implications of this or that myth. And for me, that's what poetry really is. It's manipulating the music of words. And so the sound of a poem is for me the primal level on which I experience it and what I look for when I read poetry. If it sounds good to me, I'm willing to work through difficult poetry if I like the way it sounds. So, and part of the composition process for me is reading the poems aloud and seeing how they sound and seeing if I can read them with conviction all the way through. And if I have to sort of stumble over a line or a line doesn't sound right, then that's a sure sign that the poem's not done.
And so what readers that you've heard sort of patterned your own way to hear and read poetry? You
know, I think I just started doing that on my own from the very beginning, even when my poems sounded very, very different than they do now. But I will say that James Merrill was a superb reader. Anthony Hecht was a superb reader. And you really felt when you heard them read that they were putting everything into it, and those were models which I aspired to emulate.
Now, I'd like you to read us the seventh sonnet, if you wouldn't mind, in the sequence as if.
Yeah, sure.
And let me just before you read it, let me just ask something probably very indiscreet for you. I mean, you just read that last poem, Words on Words, which is obviously about language and language referring to itself. And I guess the largest book is a dictionary.
Yes. That's right.
So about language, just this incredible abundance of words and so on, and lots of your poems in this collection make language itself, art, the subject of,
Yeah.
of the book. And somehow, to me, this sonnet sequence seems different to me. It seems as though there is a real, there's an experience behind it. And that may be just pure art on your part, but it struck me as somehow, it just felt different. And I was wondering, without going into biographical detail, if, you know, is there an experience there of some kind?
I wouldn't say that there's one experience. The poem constructs a kind of plot, a love story that is a constructed plot, and where the beloved and the muse are interchangeable, and love and poetry sort of continue to switch positions. But any poem that deals with that kind of territory, that deals with love and with identity and with trying to find one's voice, is going to contain things that are deeply personal. So certainly real personal experiences, heartbreak, both amorous and literary, inform that poem.
Right.
Though in putting it together, you try to make it have a narrative coherence that perhaps it didn't. You know, perhaps it assimilates a whole lot of things that happened at different times and makes some of it up. But I want the poem to have that feel.
Well, it has that feel, and it seems like an almost ars, kind of an ars poetica, in the sense that it's kind of also a justification of the kind of poetry you're writing, as opposed to the lover's, you know, new lover who writes this kind of formless whatever. But at any rate, why don't you? Would you mind reading the seventh poem?
Not at all.
And it's not, doesn't exactly have the F word in it, but I think it has the S word in it. But I think we can get. I think we can get away with that.
We can get away with that. Okay. Okay. Your lover is a problem, I'll admit. I know I cannot match his gift, his scope. He frequents prostitutes. He peddles dope. Much less his publications. He's a shit. He's all hooked in where I'm all locked out. I wonder you don't notice he's a bore. At writing school they called him running sore. Perhaps he cleared that up. I have no doubt that his high ship of great verse, bound for you, as self-regard puffs out its paper sails, and contemporary readers, never fails to meet today's aesthetic, flat and true, too true to be good. I see why he's your man. His poems aren't metaphors, and they don't scan.
Excellent, excellent. So you want to see that as a sort of a generalized experience.
Well, the reader is free to take it for what they want to take it for, and I did have the experience of reading that whole sequence at one time down in Auburn, Alabama, where I grew up, and as I read it, the audience got quite moved, and then I realized afterwards that they all were taking it as very literal, autobiographical, and they thought they knew the woman the poem was about, and they were coming after. I really hope it works out. Don't give up. And I had to just sort of smile and play along. But you know, poems don't. Even if poems aren't straightforwardly autobiographical, a lot of your experience goes into them, or they don't work, you know, or they just sound like an intellectual exercise, or they come off as hollow. So whatever transformation it goes through as you turn the materials of your life into art, you know, it has to remain true to that life. I mean, there wasn't the rival poet in there. As much as anything comes from Shakespeare, and
scope. I noticed
that
word
the
scope,
gift,
Shakespearean.
The scope, the high ship of great verse, bound for you. I mean, that comes right out of the Shakespeare sonnets. And I was doing a sonnet sequence. And I think, okay, this guy needs a rival. He needs some rival who's besting him, but that doesn't mean I didn't have the experience of being bested by rivals many times.
Exactly. But what struck me, you know, again in that sequence was, you know, you're always referring to the artfulness of poetry, and the fact that sonnet sequences are as much about language as they are about a real experience. And it seemed as though at least the persona of the poem was, or at least you were presenting it as something like a realer experience than some of the other
Yeah.
sonnet sequences.
Yeah.
And that gave it a certain
Yes, yes, thank you.
certain innovative power
Yes,
to it.
thank you.
Now, in your elegy, Mobile Bay Jubilee, you speak of poetry scored in a form designed like a Baroque demented booby trap to catch its victim, reader, by surprise. And I was struck by the phrase, a Baroque demented booby trap. And I'm wondering if you would you accept, if someone called you, at least this book, a modern Baroque poet, or there's something Baroque about the poems in this
I
in
would
this book?
certainly say that there's something Baroque about that poem in particular, and about a number of the poems. I mean, when you some of the poems are in very complicated forms. That form is actually a form that I borrow from Edmund Spenser. It's the form of his great poem, The Prothalamion. That 18-line stanza and that rhyme scheme is something that I took from him. But there is something Baroque about the way those rhymes repeat, and the short lines and the long lines. So I would say that there certainly is an element of the Baroque in my work.
Well, I was just wondering, you know, as a student at Yale, and I guess was it Austin Warren, or, you know, writing all this stuff about the Baroque and so on. I didn't know whether maybe in your lineage, where you were mentioning the 19th century. Well, let's go to Sonnet 6, and the speaker writes to his lover, "For you alone I'd sing, I'd stop the show, and all the profs from Yale to Vanderbilt would write us up as classics." Yeah. So what about Yale and Vanderbilt, and what did I have a sense of what that means there? But give us a sense. Maybe you don't want to be that explicit about it.
No. I'm glad to be that explicit about it.
Yeah.
I mean, that's, you know, Northeastern and Southern. In a way, there's competing intellectual traditions. I mean, I'm a Southerner by birth and by upbringing, but I went to Yale, and in many ways I felt more at home in the sort of East Coast aesthetic than I did in the Southern aesthetic, particularly to the extent, not that the Vanderbilt guys did this, but that they you know, a lot of Southern poets are sort of Southern narrative poets, and that's never been a tradition that I felt that at home in. But so that's part of the joke. But both of those places are prominent places in the history of literary criticism in the 20th century, and coming from different places. I think Robert Benoit was probably at both places, but then there's another private joke or two there. One of my very best friends, a wonderful poet named Greg Williamson, went to Vanderbilt. And so I think that probably has Vanderbilt on my mind a good bit. And hey, Vanderbilt fits the rhyme scheme.
It certainly does. It certainly does. So, I was wondering whether there wasn't deconstruction, new criticism there.
Sure. Those are, you know, that's
part of the traditions.
That's right. Part of what Yale and Yale with the deconstructive element and the Bloomian element. I studied with Bloom at Yale, and that was a very important experience for me. But Vanderbilt, of course, is where the new criticism comes, comes from to a large extent. And the idea really is that, you know, that you're trying to cover a spectrum, and that people coming from very different, you know, if you're really a classic, then people coming from these very different schools will perhaps recognize it. Yes.
Yeah, exactly. Well, would you say then that Bloom was the most powerful influence on your experience of poetry when you were an undergraduate at Yale?
He was very powerful, and not just through him, but a lot of the teachers I studied with had been his students. So his notion of, and while a lot of poets react against Bloom, I found his ideas about the relation between literary texts very enabling. I mean, it took me years to learn how to sort of use those ideas, but the idea that you are struggling with your precursors, that what the poet does has to do is carve out his or her space, you know, against this tradition, and that when you invoke something you can't just invoke it, you have to do something with it. You have to trope it. You have to play off of it. You can't just invoke Keats or invoke Shelley. You have to do something with them when you bring them into the poem, or you're not really going to get anywhere. And so that sense of intertextual dynamics, which Bloom really opened up for generations of readers, very much informed my reading of poetry, my understanding of how poetry really worked, and my notion of what I could do when I grew into the art. Growing into the art takes a while, but it was still helpful and ultimately enabling to have that kind of knowledge of how things work.
Well, unfortunately, we've only got about a minute and a half left. I wanted to just mention that your book ends on an elegiac note. So in fact, I think the last 21 pages of the book contain 2 pretty long elegies. So tell me about, for you, the elegiac and what that means, and does it have anything to do with your being a poet, a Southern poet? Is Tate behind it?
I mean, as Shelley said, our sweetest songs are those that tell of saddest thought. And I do think that in poetry, the present is always in dialogue with a past, with a past that is receding, and that a lot of the richness of the experience of poems, a lot of the experience of being moved by poems, has to do with it touching on a feeling of the evanescence of things, a feeling that things are brief, that they're ephemeral, and you're just trying to catch these things for a brief moment and hold them up to some sort of light. And I do think that the elegiac, I mean, clearly my work is elegiac, my temperament is elegiac. It's as much, even more so, in the new book as it was in the first one.
Well, in the 30 seconds we have left, so is that what you want to leave our audience with in the new book? They can look to a cultivation of this elegiac note?
I think the new book has more elegies in it. It has a little elegy for Donald Justice, an elegy for Anthony Hecht, and an elegy for my parents. It also is consciously more of a public book. The first book is more about the struggle to make art in private. But when your book is published, suddenly you're no longer making art in private, and then you have to deal with being more of a public figure, and I think the book tries to address and engage that.
Well, we really look forward to that book when it's coming out and was being published. It's been great speaking with you.
It's been nice being here.
Thanks very much. And we've been speaking with poet Joseph Harrison. Thank you for watching.